Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 128, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. My friends arrived from Tennessee. They're going to be here for a month, and they are staying in our rental house next door. Dina is a sewist, and I'm hoping to have her on the podcast soon because she's got a thriving machine embroidery business back in Tennessee. And machine embroidery is one of those topics that I haven't covered as much as I would like to, mostly because I'm learning it myself. So hopefully she can give us some pointers. Dina and another friend of mine, whose name also happens to be Janet, the three of us went to Spokane yesterday. The other Janet, that's how we're variously known depending on who's talking about us. But the other Janet has a serger, a baby lock serger, and she couldn't get it in for service here in a timely manner. And I suggested we go over to the Quilting Bee in Spokane because they have one-day service. They've got 4 techs on staff. So she made an appointment and we picked her up at 7 o'clock yesterday morning and drove to Spokane. It was an absolutely gorgeous day, about 75 degrees and sunny. There was a little bit of road construction. We did run into that, as is typical in the summer. But we got over there right when the store opened. She dropped her machine off, and we turned around and went back to Coeur d'Alene, which is about a half an hour drive, and went to a store there called the Pink Thread. It opened last fall, and I've been there a couple of times. It's a cute little store. They have some quilt fabric, but they have a fair bit of garment fabric. And the other Janet does quilt. She makes small quilt projects, but she really likes to sew garments. So we went there, and I bought some purple chambray and a little bit of a pink Swiss dot fabric. And both of those are destined to become summer tops. The other Janet got some white knit fabric to make a t-shirt. We stopped for lunch, and then on our way back to Spokane, we went to Becky's Sewing Center, which is also in Coeur d'Alene, and each of us got some fabric there. I got some more Tilda chambray for a few more tops. I'm just trying to round out my top selection in my closet because it's lovely to be able to go in and pick out something to wear. Dina also makes small items to sell at the farmer's market, so she got fabric for bowl cozies and aprons and placemats and a few other things. We went back to Spokane and I took the car through the car wash because it needed it, and then we went to Value Village because I always like to check there for machines. There was an old, like a 60s vintage turquoise blue Olympia machine, and I hate to leave them in thrift stores anymore because I don't want them to end up in landfills, but I don't have room for any more of these sewing machines, so I left it there. But I did find about 3 yards of a really pretty black and white print knit fabric that would make a great dress, so I bought that. It was a whopping $3.99. By that time, Janet's machine was done, so we popped back over to the quilt store and did a little more shopping and picked up her machine and then headed home. I should add that we also went to the Shabby Fabric showroom, which is in Post Falls, Idaho, and that's right off of I-90 between Coeur d'Alene and Spokane. So if you're ever in that area, that is also worth a stop. I bought 5 half-yard cuts of some 1930s reproduction fabric. I have a 1930s reproduction stash, and one of these days I'm going to make a quilt from it. I've used bits and pieces of the stash for other projects, but I think it needs to become a full-size quilt at some point, so those pieces of fabric will get put in that stash. We got home about 8 o'clock. It was a long day, but a productive one, and we enjoyed the ride and enjoyed talking to each other. I have done a little bit of sewing this week. I finished the Burnside bibs for my friend Dawn, and she and I are just trying to connect so I can hand them over to her. She's been having some car trouble this week, so we weren't able to connect when we wanted to on Wednesday, so it may be next week by the time I get them to her. But they're all done. They turned out great, and I'm excited for her to have them. I'm also about halfway through making another rayon woven top using my custom drafted top pattern. This is out of, it's kind of a denim blue rayon with dark blue dots all over it, kind of an abstract print. I got it at a Clean Stitch down in Missoula the last time I was down there teaching. So I'll finish that probably this afternoon. And I still want to start that Seamwork Loo raincoat. I have the dry oil skin from Merchant & Mills that I got at the Confident Stitch down in Missoula, and I'm kind of itching to start that one. So things are happening. The garden is growing. A few of the plants succumbed to the cold temperatures we had last week and the week before, but other stuff is growing great, and I think it'll be a good year. The tomatoes look phenomenal, and I mostly need to make tomato sauce and salsa this fall, so I'm happy about that. Today I want to talk about how to diagnose problems, because what may look to you like a very experienced sewist is probably just someone who has really gotten good at problem solving. One of the things that I like to tell my students in my classes is that this is not neurosurgery, and no one's going to die if you make a mistake in your sewing. And I've had a few people say that that really takes the pressure off, knowing that Janet's going to help them figure out how to reverse a problem. And this applies to both garment makers and quilters, because no matter what you're sewing, you may run into problems from time to time. So I'll start by giving you an example. I made a Scout tee out of some Robert Kaufman lightweight fabric. It's almost a lawn. I had some in black and I had some in white, and I decided to use the black to make a Scout tee. And the interesting thing was I already had my machines, my serger and my sewing machine, set up with black thread, because the project I had just finished, which was a pair of Linda pants, Style Arc Linda pants, I had made those with I wouldn't call it a heavy fabric, but it was a mid-weight stretch woven fabric. And I thought, great, I'm just going to make this Scout tee. I'll knock it out. I don't have to change the thread. And the serger setup was okay, but when I got over to the machine, I noticed that my seams were puckering. And I thought, well, that's weird. Why am I having puckering problems? So here's where you have to stop and take a deep breath and not immediately leap into fiddling with the settings on your machine. I looked at the thread, and it was a Mettler thread, but it was probably a little too heavy for that lightweight material. And I looked to see what needle I had in the machine, and I actually had a 9014 needle in the machine, which is way, way too big for that fabric. So before I even started fiddling with any of the settings, I changed the thread. I put a 60 weight black thread in the machine, and I changed my needle to a 7511 Microtex. Just those two changes went a long way toward improving the look of the seam, although I did end up easing up on the tension and the presser foot pressure just a tiny little bit. If I had started messing with the settings before I changed the needle and the thread, I could have gotten myself way into the weeds and still not have been able to figure out what was going on. So it's worth it to step back and say, okay, let's look at the fabric, let's look at the needle, let's look at the thread before you even start messing with the tension. The questions that you want to ask yourself are, what exactly am I seeing? When did it start? Is it consistent or intermittent? and what changed that made this problem appear. Once you've asked and answered those questions, then you can move on to figuring out the solution. I was seeing puckered seams in a lightweight fabric. It started as soon as I sat down at the machine. It was consistent, and the part that had changed between the previous project and that one was the fabric. The next area to look at is this a technique problem or is it a fabric problem? And this one can be hard to tease apart sometimes because there are occasions when it's a little bit of both. Let's say you're making a quilt block and you can't get points to line up, or your quilt block isn't square, or your quilt won't lie flat. In that case, I would suspect a technique problem. So I would start with cutting. Are you cutting accurately? I know a lot of people dislike cutting. It's their least favorite part of making a quilt. Are you rushing through the cutting? Are you trying to cut too many layers at once? Is your rotary blade dull? Let's say that your cutting is accurate, but when you get to your sewing machine, maybe you're not making a consistent 1/4 inch seam. Maybe you need to switch to a different kind of 1/4 inch foot. And there are several varieties out there. So it's worth trying some different ones to see what you like. Some people like to have the guide on the bed of the machine. I personally like to have the guide on the side of the foot. And it doesn't hurt to measure just to make sure that you're actually getting a 1/4 inch seam. I have one machine. It's a hand crank Singer that I use sometimes if I feel like sitting on the porch and sewing outside. And it doesn't make an accurate 1/4 inch seam with the foot that I have on it. I have to put a piece of tape on the throat plate so that I know exactly where to run the edge of the fabric. Perhaps when you get to the ironing board, you're not actually pressing your blocks, you are ironing them. This is so easy to do. You put the iron down and you slide it across the fabric, and the next thing you know, you've stretched your block out of shape. Good pressing habits will go a long way toward keeping your blocks in shape. So in all those examples, it was a technique problem, not a fabric problem. In garment sewing, I find that it's often a combination of things. It could be a technique problem, but it could also be a fabric problem. It could be a technique that you've done 100 times on previous projects and not had any issues, but you encounter a new type of fabric and lo and behold, none of your techniques work anymore. On the other hand, it could very well be your technique, or it could be the fact that you're skipping a technique. So if you're not understitching, you might have problems. If you're not pressing after each seam, you might have problems. And they might have absolutely nothing to do with the fabric. So we're going to learn to read the evidence. The fabric is always telling us something. What is it telling us? If you look at your quilt block and it's consistently coming out smaller than it's supposed to, then I would check your 1/4 inch seams, because if they're too big, that makes your quilt block too small. Conversely, if your seams are too narrow, your quilt block is going to be too big. If your points keep getting chopped off, maybe you need to be more careful about putting a pin through the points on each layer of fabric so that you know where to put that stitching line to preserve the points. Are the edges of your fabric, do they look like they've been chewed up by a dog? Maybe it's time to change your rotary cutter blade. The evidence is always there in garment sewing too, although it could be a little more complicated to figure out exactly what's happening. Let's say you have a neckline that won't lie flat. If it's got a facing, did you understitch the facing? If you didn't understitch the facing, that could be part of the problem. It could even be something like using the wrong kind of interfacing on your facing. If you have a bound neckline, did you use bias binding? If you didn't use bias binding, maybe your binding doesn't have enough give to go around the curves. And again, even when you're doing bias binding, understitching is a good idea. Did you press your seams? When you go to press your seams in a garment, what I like to do is to press the seam flat before I open it up and press it, because pressing it flat helps to set the thread into the seam. Quilters do this, and garment sewists should do it too. Maybe your seam looks a little wonky, not because of the fit, but because of poor cutting habits. And I see this all the time in my garment classes, and I try not to get too picky about it, but on the other hand, it's better to start out learning good habits than to try and fix bad habits later on. But when you are cutting out a garment pattern, whether you are using a rotary cutter or a pair of scissors, it is very important to be accurate and to cut where the pattern line is. When I went to see Ryla Spode last fall for help with a pattern, we made up the muslin, and she noted that I had done an excellent job cutting it out, which makes fitting it even easier. And I was very happy to get that compliment from her. Along those same lines, when you're making a garment and you are cutting out a pattern, are you sure that you put all the markings in where they needed to be and snipped notches and marked bust lines or bust apex and things like that? Another critical piece is to make sure that you're cutting on the grain line, so that your pattern piece has the grain line going in the proper direction. And also, if there's interfacing, that the interfacing grain lines are going in the proper direction, depending on the stretch of the interfacing. I'm listing all of these possible problems, and it's not lost on me that this is why a lot of people who want to sew only get as far as quilting and never jump into garment sewing, because it's much easier to fix problems when you're quilting than it is to fix problems when you're sewing a garment. And we haven't even started talking about fit. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on fit in garments, but I will touch on this a little bit, because drag lines in a garment show you where there are problems. But just because they show you where there are problems, they don't show you necessarily how to fix those problems. So I'll give you another example. Last August, I was working on a dress pattern that was basically my woven top pattern lengthened into a dress. I was actually using a Lisa & Co pattern, the Amarena dress pattern, and it was very similar to my woven top, but it had a shawl collar, and so that's why I was using her pattern. And her patterns are quite good. I've done several of them. But I kept having, every time I made a muslin, there were drag lines from my bust, just under my bust, to the side of the dress. And they were diagonal drag lines. So I went to my fitting books, and most of my fitting books said, you need to increase the dart intake and pull that excess fabric at the side of the front up into the dart. Well, every time I did that, all I succeeded in doing was making the dart and the bust area too big. Another one of my books said that it was possible that the back was too long for the front. So I tried cutting open the front horizontally across the bust and letting it drop, which did drop out the wrinkles, and I made that change on the pattern, but it didn't quite do it. And what I eventually figured out was that I needed to shave a little bit off the side seam at the dart. It's a little hard to explain, but if you can imagine, I took my pattern piece for the front, which was on Pellin Easy pattern, so it's kind of that spun bonded material, and I folded up the dart as if I were going to sew it, and I pinned it in place so that I had a 3-dimensional representation of the front, and where that dart came together on the side and where it was seamed together with the back, I shaved about 1/4 of an inch off of the dart from the bottom going into the bottom of the arm side, and it brought it in enough that it pulled those wrinkles out. So what I had was a little bit of excess fabric at the base of the arm side in the front pattern piece, and I took it out and it pulled the wrinkles out. And that took about a week of tweaking and experimenting and probably 3 or 4 muslins. And the frustrating thing was that was not a fix that I saw in any of my fitting books. Becoming a fitting detective is probably a topic that deserves its own podcast. Just be aware that in that case, it wasn't the fabric and it wasn't my technique. It was an issue with the pattern that I had to hunt down and fix. Here's something else to consider. Sometimes, by the time you see the problem or see evidence of the problem, you're downstream from the part of the process that actually caused that problem. So a stretched out neckline might be because you didn't stay stitch the neckline as your very first step before handling the fabric, and the neckline stretched out of shape. Or perhaps you've cut borders for a quilt, but you get to the part of the process where you're attaching those borders and you realize that they are too short because your 1/4 inch seams were too narrow and your quilt came out larger than it should have. Let's do some math. Let's imagine that your 1/4 inch seam is off by 1/16 of an inch, and you have 16 seams across the width of a quilt. Your quilt is going to be an inch too big or an inch too small because you're taking that discrepancy and multiplying it across the width of a quilt. So you might be at a point in the process where you notice there's a problem, but it may have started 3 or 4 steps back, and it may have compounded as you went along. We need to talk a little bit about random problems versus repeatable ones. A random problem that pops up is probably a lot harder to diagnose than a repeatable one. Let's say you've cut 20 squares to make half square triangles and one of them comes out a little wonky. You might have misread the ruler. You might have grabbed the wrong ruler. That's happened to me. You might have misread a direction along the way. I really like instructions in a step-by-step format rather than a paragraph format because that enables me to check things off as I go. I also, when I trace patterns, I try to write down on the pattern piece what the seam allowance is, because if it's not 5/8, I'm not going to remember. Even if it is 5/8, I should probably write it down anyway. And if the pattern instructions call for a 3/8 inch seam and you sew a 1/2 inch seam, you may end up with a garment that's too small. I'm not making these examples up. I have done most of them, if not all of them. A repeatable problem, or one that shows up in multiple places, is a little easier to figure out because you have lots of opportunities to figure out what you did wrong. So random versus repeatable can be a clue in itself. Believe me, the temptation is great to blame all your problems on your machine. After all, we're perfect, right? If you think back to the example I gave at the beginning where I was making the Scout tee out of some lightweight black fabric, I could have blamed the machine. It was the machine's fault that the seam was puckering, but who was ultimately responsible for making sure that the correct needle and thread were in the machine? That was the operator. Machines are not omniscient. They are not omnipotent. They might look that way with all of the computerized bells and whistles that are on them these days, but ultimately it is still up to the sewist to make sure that the machine is doing what it is intended to do. I would like you to look at your sewing problems and issues that you run into, whether it's a quilting project or a garment project. Look at those issues that pop up as opportunities to improve and to learn something. If your necklines keep flipping up and out, that might be a sign to you that you really need to double down on the understitching and become a fabulous understitcher. If the edges of your fabric look like somebody went at them with a weed whacker, then get your shears sharpened, change your rotary cutter blade, go slowly and carefully when you are cutting out, and make an effort to be as accurate as possible. Sometimes what helps me is to look at my garment as though I am judging it in a county fair or a state fair or some kind of competition, or someone who is much more experienced than I am is looking at my garment or looking at my quilt. What's going to pop out at them as a problem? Do I have too many threads hanging out? Does the inside of my garment look messy? Then I'm going to become very careful about snipping threads as I go along. It's kind of like cleaning as you cook. Okay, I want you to become really, really good sewists because you will enjoy what you're doing even more when you can do it well. There probably won't be an episode next week. I'm going to be traveling the last week of June. I might surprise you, but as of right now, I'm not planning to do an episode next week. So you can catch up on past episodes or you can go sew. As always, if you have feedback, send it to me at janet@janetzabo.com. Use the fan mail feature or leave a comment on the show notes page. My website is www.janetzabo.com with links to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website as well as to my blog, which is where I put pictures of things that have been happening around here, some sewing, some not. You can check it out. I do have, the podcast has an Instagram account at Straight Stitch Podcast. I know I neglect to mention that sometimes because I don't spend a lot of time on Instagram, but feedback is always welcome no matter how you choose to send it. So I'm going to go sew. So until next episode, whenever that happens, I hope you have a great week or two and that you get to go sew something.